Hey everybody, today we're going to continue talking about dry fire, and we're going to go over dry firing your Glock, a couple of ideas around it and a couple of techniques. Obviously, if we're talking dry fire, please remember we're fundamentally handling firearms. Make sure you're following all of the normal firearm safety precautions and that you make sure there's no live ammunition in your workspace. The most discussed thing about Glocks and dry fire is the fact that once you've pulled the trigger or dry fired the gun and the slide doesn't cycle, your trigger is fundamentally dead. It gives you no feedback, it doesn't move forward and backwards. And there's a few ways the guys have found of getting around that. The most commonly used methods are basically non-resetting systems, because mechanically that's difficult to achieve, where your gun will work in both dry fire and live fire. And those methods would be in multiple shot drills. The guy fires the first shot or lets the striker fall on the first shot, and he continues to manipulate his trigger finger throughout the drill on a dead trigger. And the second one is to insert something in between the hood of the barrel and the breech face, unlocking the action, which will give you a trigger that moves forward and backwards, but without it resetting. For me, those two methods have been a little bit of a frustrating process to learn. The first one of just having the striker fall and then manipulating my trigger finger really didn't work well for me, because I didn't have any feedback or understanding of what I was doing to the trigger in dry fire, and that wouldn't translate well into live fire. And much the same thing happened with having a cable tie or folded paper in between the hood of the barrel and the breech face on the slide, because then I would overextend or over manipulate my trigger finger. I would take it way off the trigger when I was resetting it in dry fire. And what I noticed when I went to live fire is I was having a fundamental breakdown in how I was manipulating the trigger. And obviously that doesn't bode well for both speed and accuracy like we need in IPSC. So I went through a process of designing something that fits in between the hood of the barrel and the breech face of the slide, which gives me a trigger that's manipulating. It moves forward and backward. It does not reset the trigger, but what it does now is it allows the trigger to move in much more realistic dimensions that I would expect when I went out to live fire. And specifically where the trigger stops moving forward on the reset portion, it stops just forward of where the trigger would normally reset, and that's typically how I'm going to manipulate the trigger on the range. That's how most of us will. And that made quite a difference to how my dry fire and live fire translated in terms of trigger control and how I manipulate the trigger. So that made quite a big difference for me. I'm going to show you quickly how that fits in. If you want more information on that Glock cube, please feel free to ask. We'll do a video separate on that, how it works, how it fits in. It'll be a fairly short clip. So I've got an unloaded firearm over here, empty mag well, and I've got an empty chamber. Right, so once I've pulled the trigger or dry fired it, I will manipulate the slide backwards slowly until I get an audible click, which is essentially where the mechanics are going to allow the trigger to reset. There's my click. I insert this cube in between the hood of the barrel and the breech face on the slide. I push it downwards so that it doesn't obscure my sights. And from there I've got a trigger that I can manipulate forwards and backwards, and this most forward position is the most important dimension, because now I can manipulate the trigger and that translates well into live fire. That sort of covers that issue. Those other methods do work well enough, as long as you're being realistic about it and that you experiment with it. It's going to be a learning process to find out what works for you. There's different methods for different people and what they need to get out of it. From there, typically what I found in dry fire is if I'm working any sort of index stuff from the holster, maybe table starts, unloaded starts, getting into a low position, moving into my first position that I'm going to engage targets. When I've isolated those kind of index drills, I'm not going to be dry firing the gun. I'm not going to be pulling the trigger straight through. I'll be working on the trigger prep, and I found that to be more beneficial because I can isolate the index a little better. If I am going to be working on trigger manipulations or trigger control, I'm going to isolate those to the best of my ability. And typically what I'd recommend is that you do run a snap cap in the chamber, just from the perspective of the striker and the rear end of the breech face getting some sort of buffer or break from the mechanical slamming that you experience. You don't have the striker slamming into the rear, the breech face on the slide, and that's just going to help the mechanical components in your striker gun last a little bit longer in that area. And it's just, that's what I've done, and I think it does help make the stuff last a little longer. If you are going to be doing a lot of that, then I would recommend a snap cap. And from there, basically everything's much the same. In terms of dry fire, you have to create a trigger that's manipulating and find a system that works best for you in your dry fire, and that's ultimately what's going to make the difference. As long as you're analyzing it and thinking about your dry fire in a good way, that's going to bode well for you and your progress. One of the questions we received recently was, do I manipulate the trigger when I'm working on transition drills, those kind of things? Do I do it all the time? And the answer is no, not really. It depends on what I want to do. So let's say, for example, if I'm doing a transition specific drill and I really want to work on the transitions, I might take the trigger pull or the manipulating trigger system, the multiple shots out, and isolate the transition to what it is, getting my eyes ahead of the gun and making sure I'm transitioning the gun to the next point exactly where I want it to be. If I'm working on a multiple shot drill and I'm working on trigger speed and some other variables within it, then I will pull the trigger and have that manipulating feedback. That depends on what you want to work on, and as long as you're being realistic and open-minded about it, you can say, hey, maybe I need to work on the transition specifically, take the trigger pull out of it, or maybe I want to work on how my trigger manipulations are in relation to my transition speed, then add them in, but you're going to have to analyze that for yourself and where your dry fire currently is. That sort of covers basically what dry firing your Glock is. If you have any questions for me, please feel free to reach out. Other than that, we will have a chat soon. I'll have another video out soon. As always, if you send me some questions through, I'll answer them to the best of my abilities. Other than that, stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you on the range soon. Thanks, guys.